The city was awake long before the sun decided to show itself. Los Angeles always carried that restless energy, the low hum of engines, distant sirens, people chasing deadlines and dreams all at once. In one quiet corner of the city, far from red carpets and flashing cameras, Keanu Reeves sat alone on a simple wooden bench outside a community center that most people passed without ever noticing. He wore a faded jacket, dark jeans, and shoes that had clearly seen better days, not because he couldn't afford new ones, but because comfort mattered more than appearance. In his hands was a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, untouched, as his gaze drifted across the street where a small line of people waited for the doors to open. He wasn't scheduled to be there for another hour, yet he arrived early, as he often did. Waiting gave him time to observe, to listen without being noticed. A man coughed quietly while trying to keep his jacket wrapped tight against the morning chill. A young woman rocked a sleeping child in her arms, her face tired but determined. An elderly couple held hands, whispering to each other as if the world around them no longer existed. Keanu watched them all, not as a famous actor, not as someone recognized by millions, but simply as a human being who understood loss, silence, and the weight of unseen struggles. Across town, in a modest apartment filled with sunlight and half-packed boxes, Sandra Bullock stood barefoot on the kitchen floor, stirring oatmeal on the stove while reading an email she had already read 3 times. The message was short, polite, and filled with the kind of carefully chosen words that tried to hide desperation. It was from a small nonprofit asking for help, not money, but presence. They were organizing a quiet outreach program for families displaced by recent events, and someone had suggested her name. Sandra smiled faintly as she set the spoon down, her thoughts drifting far from Hollywood schedules and scripted lines. She had learned long ago that kindness didn't need an audience. Some of the most meaningful things she had ever done were the ones no one knew about, the ones that never made headlines. As she closed her laptop, her phone buzzed on the counter. One message, just a name on the screen. Keanu. She didn't hesitate before answering. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still warm with sleep. "Morning," he replied, calm as always. "I was wondering if you were free today." She smiled, leaning against the counter. "Depends. Are you asking as a friend or as someone with a plan?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "Maybe both," he said. "There's a community center downtown. They're opening their doors this morning. No press, no announcements, just help." Sandra closed her eyes for a moment, already knowing her answer. "Send me the address," she said. "I'll be there." Neither of them mentioned cameras. Neither of them mentioned names. They didn't need to. When Sandra arrived, the doors had just opened. Volunteers moved quietly, setting up tables with food, blankets, and supplies. There was no music playing, no speeches, just the soft sounds of people helping people. Keanu stood near the entrance, greeting everyone the same way with a nod, a gentle smile, and a sincerity that couldn't be rehearsed. When he saw Sandra walk in, he smiled wider, not in excitement, but in recognition. She belonged there as much as he did. They didn't hug, they didn't pose. They simply stood side by side and got to work. Sandra helped serve food, kneeling down to meet children at eye level, listening as if their stories were the most important thing in the world, because in that moment they were. Keanu carried boxes, cleaned tables, and sat quietly with anyone who needed someone to listen. When an elderly man struggled to button his coat, Keanu gently helped him without a word. When a woman broke down while talking about losing her home, Sandra held her hands and stayed until the tears slowed, not offering solutions, just presence. Hours passed unnoticed. Time behaved differently in places like that, stretching and shrinking all at once. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware of what was happening inside those walls. No headlines would be written, no viral clips would be shared, and that was exactly how they wanted it. During a short break, they sat on the steps outside, sharing a bottle of water. The sun had finally risen, casting a warm glow over the street. "You ever think about how loud the world is?" Sandra asked quietly. Keanu nodded, "All the time." "And how the most important things somehow happen in silence." He looked at her thoughtful. "That's because silence makes room for truth." She smiled at that, letting the words settle between them. Later that afternoon, a volunteer approached them, her hands shaking slightly. "There's another center," she said. "Outside the city, they don't get much help, no funding, barely enough food." Keanu didn't ask for details, he simply stood up. "Let's go," he said. Sandra followed without hesitation. The drive was long and quiet. The buildings slowly gave way to cracked roads and empty lots. When they arrived, the center was smaller, older, and clearly forgotten. The people there didn't recognize them, and that was a relief. They were greeted with cautious smiles and tired eyes, the kind that had learned not to expect much from anyone. They stayed until evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple, a young boy approached Keanu holding a piece of paper folded carefully in half. He didn't speak at first, just held it out. Keanu knelt down, unfolding it slowly. It was a drawing. Two stick figures holding hands beneath a sun, simple, honest. "For you," the boy whispered. Keanu swallowed hard, his voice low. "Thank you." Sandra watched from a distance, her chest tight with emotion she didn't try to hide. She understood something then, something that would stay with her long after the day ended. Kindness didn't need scale to matter. It didn't need permission. It only needed someone willing to show up. As they left that night, neither of them spoke much. The car moved through the dark, headlights cutting through silence. "This can't be a one-time thing," Sandra finally said. Keanu nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same." They didn't know yet what shape it would take. They didn't have a name for it. They only knew one thing for certain. What they felt that day was real, and once you felt something like that, you couldn't unfeel it. Somewhere in the city, a child slept holding a drawing. Somewhere else, a woman felt less alone than she had that morning. And two people who had spent their lives in the spotlight were beginning to understand that the most powerful changes happened far away from it. This was only the beginning. The kindness that chooses to stay. The days that followed did not announce themselves with dramatic changes or sudden miracles. Instead, they unfolded slowly, almost shyly, like a truth that didn't want attention. Keanu Reeves returned to his quiet routines, long walks through familiar streets, early mornings spent alone with his thoughts, yet something inside him had shifted. The images from that small community center lingered in his mind far more vividly than any film scene he had ever acted in. The tired eyes that softened when someone listened, the children who smiled not because they were promised something grand, but because someone treated them as if they mattered. He found himself thinking about how easily people were forgotten once they slipped outside society's bright lights, and how little it actually took to remind them they still belonged. Sandra Bullock felt the same restlessness. She tried to return to her regular schedule, meetings, scripts, rehearsals, but everything felt strangely hollow. Conversations about box office numbers and press tour sounded distant, almost unreal. Late at night, she would sit by her window, watching the city glow, replaying the quiet moments from the outreach centers. The way a mother's shoulders relaxed when she realized no one was rushing her story. The way a child's laughter echoed longer than expected. Sandra had built her life in a world where emotions were written, directed, and edited. Yet what she had witnessed recently was raw, unfiltered, and far more meaningful than anything captured on a screen. They spoke often, not with long phone calls filled with planning, but with short, thoughtful conversations that carried weight. Sometimes it was Keanu calling to say he'd found another place that needed help. Sometimes it was Sandra texting late at night, sharing a thought she couldn't shake. There was no rush, no pressure, just a shared understanding that something important had begun, and neither of them wanted to be the one to let it fade. One evening, Keanu found himself standing outside a modest building on the edge of the city, a shelter that operated mostly on hope and borrowed time. The paint was peeling, the sign barely readable, yet inside, people moved with quiet determination. He hadn't told anyone he was coming, not even Sandra. He wanted to see what happened when kindness arrived without a familiar face attached to it. He spent hours there, cleaning, listening, helping however he could. No one recognized him, and he didn't correct them. He was just another pair of hands, another presence in the room. When he finally stepped outside, the sky already dark, his phone buzzed. A message from Sandra. "Did you feel it again today?" He smiled faintly before replying. "Yes, and I think it's asking for more." A few days later, they met again, this time not at a shelter or a center, but at a quiet cafe tucked away from busy streets. The place was nearly empty, filled with soft light and the hum of distant conversation. They sat across from each other, hands wrapped around warm cups, both knowing this wasn't a casual meeting. There was something they needed to say out loud. "We can't just keep showing up randomly," Sandra began carefully. "Not because it's wrong, but because it's fragile. What we're doing matters, and if we're not careful, it could disappear as quietly as it started." Keanu nodded, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need something steady, not a brand, not a spotlight, just a way to keep this alive." They talked for hours, not about money or recognition, but about intention, about how easily good things became complicated once attention found them, about how kindness often lost its purity the moment it was turned into a performance. They agreed on one thing above all else. Whatever they built, it had to remain quiet, grounded, and human. No names attached, no faces promoted, just action. That was when the idea truly took shape. Not a foundation in the traditional sense, but a network, invisible to the world, yet deeply rooted where it mattered most. A way to support local efforts without taking control from them. A way to help without becoming the story. They didn't give it a grand name. They didn't even write it down at first. It existed only in conversations, in shared glances, in the understanding that sometimes the strongest movements were the ones no one tried to own. Their first test came sooner than expected. A message arrived late one night from a volunteer Sandra had met months earlier while filming abroad. A small town had been hit hard by unexpected flooding. Homes were damaged, resources scarce, and help slow to arrive. The message wasn't dramatic. It was simple and honest. "We're trying, but we're overwhelmed." Sandra forwarded it to Keanu with just 3 words. "Can we go?" They didn't hesitate. They arrived quietly without advance notice, without any official presence. The town was exhausted, heavy with loss and uncertainty. Mud-covered streets, families salvaging what little they could, children clinging to parents who were trying to stay strong despite having no answers. Keanu and Sandra didn't announce who they were. They introduced themselves like anyone else, offering help, asking questions, listening first. They carried supplies, cleared debris, and sat with families as they shared stories they had likely repeated too many times already. Sandra spent hours with a group of children, helping them draw pictures of what they hoped their homes would look like again. Keanu worked alongside local volunteers, his hands blistered, his clothes soaked, yet his focus never wavered. No one treated them differently, and that was exactly how they wanted it. One night, as they sat on the steps of a temporary shelter, the air heavy with humidity and fatigue, Sandra spoke softly. "Do you ever worry this will break us? That caring this much will take something we won't get back?" Keanu stared ahead, watching distant lights flicker in the darkness. "It already has," he said quietly. "But it's also given something back, something I didn't realize I was missing." She looked at him, understanding without needing him to explain. They both knew the cost of feeling deeply in a world that often rewarded detachment, yet neither of them wanted to turn away. When they left the town days later, they didn't leave behind speeches or promises. They left behind resources, connections, and something far more valuable, a sense that someone had stood with them when they needed it most. Back home, they continued quietly, helping from a distance, supporting local leaders, responding when called. They avoided interviews, declined opportunities that would turn their efforts into headlines. It wasn't always easy. Questions began to surface. Whispers spread. Why were they always disappearing? Why weren't they promoting what they were doing? They ignored it. Because every time doubt crept in, a message would arrive. A photo of a rebuilt classroom. A note from a volunteer saying morale had changed. A simple thank you written in uneven handwriting. One night, Sandra sat alone, reading through those messages, her eyes heavy with emotion. She realized something that stopped her cold. The world didn't need louder voices. It needed more people willing to listen. When she shared that thought with Keanu, he replied with a single line. "Then let's keep listening." And so they did. Unseen by most, uncelebrated by many, their quiet kindness continued to spread, not like fire, but like roots, deep, patient, and impossible to erase once they took hold. And neither of them knew yet that what they were building would soon face its greatest challenge, one that would test not only their resolve, but their faith in how much good the world was truly willing to believe in. When silence is challenged. Silence, Keanu realized, was powerful only as long as the world allowed it to exist. As weeks turned into months, the quiet work he and Sandra had chosen began to ripple farther than either of them expected. It didn't explode into fame. It didn't announce itself loudly, but it moved steadily, carried by people whose lives had been touched in moments when they felt forgotten. A teacher in a damaged village now had books for her students. A small clinic could keep its doors open because supplies arrived just in time. A family rebuilt a roof because someone showed up when no one else did. None of it carried names or signatures, yet patterns emerged, and patterns always attracted attention. Sandra noticed it first during a routine interview for a film project. The questions began predictably, then shifted without warning. The interviewer leaned forward slightly, curiosity sharp in his eyes, and asked about the rumors, about the places she had been seen, about the mysterious help showing up in struggling communities shortly after her visits. Sandra paused, choosing her words carefully, aware of how easily truth could be twisted once it left her mouth. She smiled politely and redirected the conversation back to the film. But she felt it then, the pressure of curiosity pushing against the quiet space she and Keanu had built. That night, she called him. "They're starting to ask questions," she said softly. "Not aggressive yet, but it's coming." Keanu wasn't surprised. He had sensed it too. Strangers approached him more often now, not for autographs, but with probing looks, half-formed assumptions, questions disguised as compliments. He listened calmly, as he always did, but the weight of it settled heavy on his chest. "We knew this wouldn't stay invisible forever," he replied. "The question is whether we let it change what we're doing." Sandra leaned back on her couch, staring at the ceiling. "I don't want this to become something people argue about," she said. "The moment kindness turns into a debate, it loses its meaning." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. "Then we don't debate," he said quietly. "We keep going." The next challenge arrived not with words, but with circumstance. A coastal region overseas was hit by a powerful storm, leaving entire neighborhoods flooded and isolated. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and help was slow to reach the most remote areas. Messages poured in from volunteers asking for guidance, for resources, for reassurance. This wasn't something they could address quietly from afar. This time, presence mattered. They traveled without announcement, arriving in a place that felt suspended between chaos and resilience. The air smelled of salt and wet earth. Streets had turned into rivers, homes into ruins. Families waited in silence, exhaustion written into their posture. Keanu and Sandra stepped into the work immediately, distributing supplies, helping evacuate those who couldn't move on their own, standing in water that soaked their clothes and numbed their legs. There was no glamour in it, no comfort, only urgency. For 3 days, they barely slept. Sandra helped organize temporary shelters, calming frightened children and listening to parents who were trying not to break. Keanu worked alongside local crews, lifting debris, helping restore basic access routes, never once stepping back when things became difficult. People began to notice them, not as celebrities, but as constants, always there, always willing. It was inevitable that someone filmed them. The clip was short, shaky, taken from a distance. It showed Keanu carrying an elderly woman through floodwater, Sandra holding a child wrapped in a blanket, her face tired but steady. The video spread quickly, shared not for shock or drama, but for something far more dangerous: admiration. Within hours, speculation followed. Headlines appeared online, some praising, others questioning motives. Was this genuine? Was it calculated? Was it another image carefully crafted for public approval? Sandra saw the comments late one night, sitting alone in a quiet room while rain hammered against the windows outside. The words blurred together, praise tangled with suspicion, kindness reduced to a theory people debated from behind screens. She felt something tighten in her chest, not anger but sadness. "They don't believe it," she said quietly when Keanu joined her. "Some of them can't." Keanu sat beside her, his clothes still damp, his hands rough from days of work. He didn't look at the screen. "That's okay," he said gently. "Belief isn't required for kindness to exist." "But it hurts," she admitted. "Not for us, but for the people we're helping. If this turns into noise, it could distract from what actually matters." Keanu nodded slowly. "Then we protect the work, not ourselves." The following days were harder. Volunteers grew anxious as attention increased. Some worried support would disappear once controversy took hold. Others feared being used as symbols in a story they never asked to be part of. Keanu and Sandra addressed those concerns quietly, reassuring everyone that nothing would change. Help would continue. Focus would remain where it belonged. They made a decision then, one that would define everything that followed. They would step back from visibility entirely, even more than before. No more public appearances tied to relief efforts. No more being present where cameras might follow. The work would continue through trusted hands, through people who lived there, through systems that didn't rely on faces. It wasn't an easy choice. Sandra felt it deeply the day they left the flooded region. As their vehicle moved away, she looked back at the people standing together, waving, smiling despite everything they had lost. She wondered if stepping back meant abandoning them, even though she knew logically it didn't. Emotional truth often ignored logic. Keanu sensed her hesitation. "You're not leaving them," he said softly. "You're trusting them." That word stayed with her, trust. Back home, the noise grew louder for a while. Articles speculated. Opinions clashed. Some praised their restraint. Others accused them of hiding something. Keanu refused to respond publicly. Sandra declined interviews. Silence, once their shield, now became their statement. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The stories that mattered didn't come from media outlets. They came from people on the ground. Volunteers shared experiences. Communities spoke about what had changed, not because of who helped them, but because help had arrived at all. The conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly, away from names and back toward outcomes. One evening, Sandra received a handwritten letter forwarded from a remote village. The paper was thin, the ink uneven. It didn't mention her or Keanu. It simply said, "Someone helped us when we were drowning. They didn't ask for thanks, so now we help each other." She read it twice, then once more aloud to Keanu. Neither of them spoke for a long time afterward. In that silence, they understood something vital. True kindness would always be misunderstood by those who looked for spectacle. It would always be questioned by those who needed proof to believe in goodness. But it would also always survive, passed quietly from one person to another, stronger than doubt. They weren't building a movement anymore. They were protecting a principle. And as the world continued to test it, they knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because silence, once challenged, demanded courage to maintain. And courage, unlike fame, never came without cost. The weight of caring. Kindness, when practiced long enough, began to carry weight. It wasn't heavy in the way fame was heavy, loud and demanding, but heavy in a quieter, deeper way, the kind that settled into the bones and followed you into sleep. Keanu felt it most in the early mornings, waking before dawn with a sense of urgency he couldn't fully explain. His body was tired more often now, not from age, but from giving without pause, from constantly holding space for other people's pain. He never complained, not out loud, but there were moments when he sat alone, staring at nothing, wondering how much one person was meant to carry. Sandra noticed the change before he said anything. She saw it in the way he moved more slowly after long trips, in the silence that stretched just a bit longer between his words. She recognized it because she felt it too. Compassion, when it was real, didn't end when you left the place where it was needed. It followed you home, replayed itself in your thoughts, crept into quiet moments when there was no distraction to push it away. She found herself crying sometimes for no clear reason, overwhelmed not by sadness alone, but by the sheer scale of how much hurt existed in the world. They met one evening at a small park overlooking the city, sitting on opposite ends of a bench as the sky darkened. The air was cool, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter and breathe a little deeper. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Silence had become their shared language. "I don't know if I can keep going at this pace," Sandra finally said, her voice steady but honest. "Not because I don't want to help, but because I'm afraid of burning out and becoming numb." Keanu nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "The worst thing that could happen isn't that we stop, it's that we keep going without feeling anything." That truth sat between them, heavy and undeniable. Caring deeply required energy, and energy wasn't endless. They had both seen people who started with good intentions lose themselves in the process, turning compassion into obligation, obligation into resentment. Neither of them wanted that. They talked that night about boundaries, about learning to rest without guilt, about trusting others to carry the work forward when they couldn't. It felt strange to acknowledge limits after months of pushing past them, but it also felt necessary. If kindness was going to last, it had to be sustainable. Not long after that conversation, another call came in. A region struggling with long-term displacement needed support, not emergency relief, but something more delicate and complex. People had been living in temporary shelters for years, forgotten by systems that moved on once headlines faded. Schools were overcrowded. Medical care was inconsistent. Hope was thin. Sandra hesitated when she read the message. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew what saying yes would mean. Long days, heavy stories, little rest. She forwarded it to Keanu with a single question. "Do we go?" He didn't reply right away. Hours passed. When his response finally came, it was simple. "We don't have to go alone." That changed everything. Instead of arriving themselves, they reached out quietly to people they trusted, individuals who had worked alongside them before and understood the importance of humility and discretion. They coordinated support from afar, ensuring resources reached the right hands, empowering local leaders rather than inserting themselves into the center of the story. It felt different, almost uncomfortable at first, stepping back while still caring deeply, but it also felt right. They visited briefly, without staying long, just enough to listen, to understand, to connect faces to the names they would be supporting from a distance. Sandra spent an afternoon in a makeshift classroom, watching children recite lessons with a seriousness far beyond their years. Keanu walked through the camp with local organizers, learning where systems failed and where small changes could make the biggest difference. One moment stayed with him. A teenage boy, quiet and reserved, explained how he taught younger children to read using old newspapers because there were no books. He didn't ask for help directly. He didn't complain. He simply shared his reality. Keanu listened, nodding slowly, and later ensured that books arrived without anyone knowing who sent them. When they left, there were no hugs goodbye, no dramatic farewells. Just nods, shared looks, a mutual understanding that support would continue even when they were gone. Back home, the pace slowed slightly, intentionally. Sandra declined projects that demanded too much emotional energy. Keanu adjusted his schedule, allowing space to breathe. They checked in on each other often, not about plans or logistics, but about how they were feeling. It was an unspoken agreement that caring for themselves was part of caring for others. Still, doubt crept in during quiet moments. Was stepping back a form of failure? Was distance diluting impact? These questions surfaced late at night when exhaustion blurred certainty. Sandra found herself staring at the ceiling one evening, replaying faces, wondering if she was doing enough. She messaged Keanu, not expecting an immediate reply. "Do you ever worry that slowing down means letting people down?" His response came quickly. "I think slowing down is how we make sure we don't." That reassurance mattered more than he probably knew. Over time, they began to see the results of this shift. Communities they supported started reaching out not with requests but with updates, schools expanding, clinics stabilizing, local volunteers training others. The work was continuing without them at the center, and that was the point. Kindness was no longer something they carried alone. It was something being shared. One evening, Sandra received a video from a volunteer she barely remembered meeting. It showed a group of children opening boxes of supplies, laughing, cheering, unaware of where they came from. No mention of names. No acknowledgement of origin, just joy. She watched it twice, then once more with tears in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the weight in her chest felt lighter. She sent the video to Keanu with a simple message. "This is working." He replied with a single word. "Yes." Yet even as balance began to return, life reminded them that kindness never existed in a vacuum. Loss, pain, and unpredictability remained part of the world. One late afternoon, Keanu received news that shook him deeply. Someone he had known for years, a quiet volunteer who had given everything to others, had fallen ill, worn down by the same exhaustion they had been discussing. It was a stark reminder of how thin the line was between giving and losing yourself. Keanu sat alone that night, the city lights blurred beyond his window, thinking about how easily people who cared the most disappeared without notice. He understood then that part of their mission wasn't just helping communities survive. It was protecting the people who helped them do it. The next day, he shared that thought with Sandra, and they made another quiet decision. They would build rest into kindness, support for caregivers, encouragement to pause, permission to step back without shame. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visible, but it was necessary. Because if kindness was going to change the world, it had to change how people treated themselves too. As night fell once again over the city, Sandra and Keanu sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky darken. The work wasn't finished. It never would be. But for the first time in a long while, the weight felt manageable, shared, grounded in something deeper than urgency. They had learned that caring didn't mean sacrificing everything. Sometimes, it meant knowing when to rest, when to trust, and when to let kindness breathe. And that understanding would soon be tested, in ways neither of them could yet imagine. When kindness cost something, there came a moment when kindness stopped feeling gentle and began to feel dangerous, not because of enemies or opposition, but because of how deeply it demanded honesty. Keanu felt that shift on a quiet afternoon when the phone rang with news that didn't involve disasters, shelters, or communities in need, but something closer, something that couldn't be solved with supplies or presents. A close friend, someone who had supported the quiet work from the beginning without ever asking questions, was struggling deeply, not with circumstance, but with purpose. Years of giving had hollowed him out, leaving him exhausted, disconnected, unsure of who he was outside of being useful. It was the very thing Keanu and Sandra had feared, compassion turning inward and collapsing under its own weight. Keanu sat with that realization for hours, the room around him still and silent, understanding in a way that felt painfully personal that kindness, when misunderstood, could become a prison. People who gave endlessly often forgot they were allowed to need help themselves. That truth shook him more than any criticism or doubt ever had. It forced him to confront a question he had avoided for months. What if doing good wasn't enough if it destroyed the people who carried it? Sandra sensed something was wrong the moment he called. His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness beneath it that couldn't be hidden. He told her everything, not as a plan or a problem to solve, but as a confession. She listened without interrupting, the silence between his words filled with recognition. She had seen it too, in volunteers, in caregivers, in herself on nights when sleep wouldn't come because the weight of the world pressed too hard against her chest. "We taught people how to give," she said quietly when he finished, "but we never taught them how to stop." That sentence changed the shape of everything. They met the next day, not to plan another mission, but to sit together and talk about failure, about the limits of good intentions, about the responsibility that came with inspiring others. For the first time since the work began, they allowed themselves to consider that kindness without guidance could become harmful, not because it wasn't sincere, but because it lacked balance. They realized that the silence they valued so deeply had also kept important conversations hidden. No one wanted to admit they were tired. No one wanted to say they couldn't keep going. That realization hurt, because it meant acknowledging that something they had built with love needed to change. They began quietly reaching out not to communities but to the people who had helped build the invisible network. Volunteers, organizers, caregivers, they asked simple questions, ones that hadn't been asked before. "How are you really doing? What do you need? When was the last time you rested?" The responses came slowly at first, hesitant, unsure if honesty was welcome. But once one person admitted they were struggling, others followed. Stories poured in, not of failure, but of exhaustion, of fear, of guilt for wanting to step back when so many still needed help. Sandra read every message. Some nights she cried, not out of despair, but out of a fierce determination to protect these people who had given so much. She understood now that the quiet movement they had helped nurture was alive, and like any living thing, it needed care, boundaries, and rest to survive. They made another decision, one that felt even more difficult than stepping back from the spotlight. They would speak, not loudly, not publicly, but directly to the people who mattered. They organized small, private gatherings, safe spaces where volunteers could talk without feeling judged or measured by how much they gave. Keanu attended the first one quietly, sitting in the back, listening as people shared stories they had never said out loud. One woman admitted she felt invisible unless she was helping someone else. A man confessed he felt guilty sleeping while others suffered. Another spoke about losing joy because pain had become his entire focus. Keanu didn't offer speeches. He didn't give advice. When it was his turn to speak, he simply said something that surprised everyone. He admitted he had felt the same way. He spoke about mornings when the world felt too heavy to carry and nights when silence felt less like peace and more like isolation. He told them that choosing to rest didn't make them selfish. It made them human. The room changed after that. Shoulders relaxed. Breaths deepened. People cried not because they were broken, but because they finally felt seen. Sandra watched it happen with quiet awe. She realized then that this was the most important work they had done so far, not feeding bodies or rebuilding homes, but protecting the hearts of those who gave. Kindness, she understood, wasn't just about action. It was about sustainability, about teaching people that caring deeply didn't mean disappearing. But change, even necessary change, came with resistance. Some questioned the shift, worried that slowing down would weaken the impact. Others misunderstood, thinking rest meant retreat. Whispers spread again, quieter than before, but persistent. Had the movement lost its edge? Was it becoming soft? Sandra felt the familiar tug of doubt return, but this time it didn't settle in her chest. It passed through her, leaving clarity behind. She and Keanu talked late into the night, revisiting the beginning, remembering why they had chosen silence in the first place. Not to hide, but to protect the purity of intention. That intention hadn't changed. It had evolved. Then came the moment that tested everything. A sudden crisis erupted in a place they had supported from afar for months. Resources were strained. Local systems were overwhelmed. The call for help was urgent, and people expected Keanu and Sandra to show up, to lead, to carry it the way they had before. Sandra felt the pull immediately, that instinct to drop everything and go, to put her own balance aside for the sake of need. She looked at Keanu, waiting to see the same impulse in his eyes. Instead, she saw hesitation, not fear but wisdom. "If we go like before," he said quietly, "we undo everything we've been teaching." The decision hurt. It felt wrong at first, like abandonment, like choosing comfort over responsibility. But they held firm. Instead of going themselves, they activated the network they had built, trusting others to step forward, to lead, to support one another. They stayed present through communication, guidance, and resources, but they did not become the center. And something extraordinary happened. People rose. Volunteers coordinated with clarity and confidence. Local leaders made decisions without waiting for approval. Support flowed efficiently, not because someone famous was present, but because people believed they could do it themselves. The crisis stabilized faster than expected, not through heroics, but through collective strength. Sandra watched the updates come in, her heart pounding with emotion. It worked, not because of her or Keanu, but because the movement had matured beyond them. That night she and Keanu sat together, the city quiet around them, the air heavy with reflection. "This was the hardest thing we've done," she said softly. Keanu nodded, because it required letting go. They understood then that true kindness sometimes meant stepping aside, allowing others to discover their own strength, even if it meant surrendering control and recognition entirely. It meant trusting that the good they had helped plant could grow without them standing over it. And in that understanding, something within both of them finally eased. The work was no longer consuming them. It was living through others. And that realization, as painful and beautiful as it was, prepared them for the final truth they were about to face, one that would redefine what legacy truly meant. The world they never tried to change. The world did not wake up one morning and declare itself different. There were no announcements, no grand moments where everything suddenly felt healed. Change, Keanu and Sandra had learned, never arrived like that. It came quietly, unnoticed at first, woven into ordinary days where people chose patience instead of anger, understanding instead of judgment, and action instead of indifference. And in that quiet unfolding, they began to see something extraordinary, not because their names were attached to it, but because they were. Months passed, and the invisible network they had once worried might collapse without their constant presence continued to move with steady confidence. Communities no longer waited for direction. They reached out to one another. A small school shared resources with another hundreds of miles away. A group of caregivers created a rotation so no one carried the burden alone. Volunteers reminded each other to rest, to step back, to live beyond the work. Kindness had learned how to breathe. Sandra noticed it during a visit to a modest neighborhood she had once supported quietly. She walked through streets that now felt alive, not because they were perfect, but because people greeted one another with familiarity and care. She wasn't recognized, and she didn't mind. She sat on a bench near a small playground watching children laugh, listening to the sound of life moving forward. A woman sat beside her, striking up a casual conversation, talking about how people had come together during hard times, how strangers had become neighbors, how help had arrived when hope was thin, and then stayed long enough to teach others how to help too. "They never asked for thanks," the woman said, smiling softly. "They just showed us what was possible." Sandra nodded, her throat tight, knowing those words weren't about her and feeling grateful for that truth. Keanu experienced something similar during a long walk through a familiar part of the city. He passed a small cafe that offered free meals twice a week, not advertised, not sponsored, just quietly available. Inside, people moved with purpose, serving food, listening, sitting together. On a wall near the counter hung a simple handwritten sign that read, "Help when you can, rest when you need, trust others to do the same." He stood there longer than he meant to, absorbing the weight of it, understanding that this sentence carried more meaning than any speech he had ever given. Later that evening, he and Sandra met once again at the same park where they had shared so many conversations, the skyline glowing softly in the distance. They sat side by side, not discussing plans, not reviewing progress, simply existing in the calm that had been hard-earned. "I used to think legacy was something you left behind," Sandra said quietly. "Something people talked about after you were done." Keanu smiled faintly. "I think it's something you live while you're still here, whether anyone notices or not." They reflected on the journey, on the choices that had felt impossible at the time, on the moments when silence had been misunderstood and restraint had been criticized. None of it felt heavy anymore. Those moments were simply part of the path, necessary steps that taught them what kindness truly required, not sacrifice without limit, not presence without pause, but trust, trust in people, trust in the idea that goodness did not belong to individuals but moved through them. The world continued, as it always had, with beauty and cruelty existing side by side. There were still crises, still loss, still moments when it felt easier to turn away. But now, scattered across cities and villages, across cultures and borders, were people who had learned something simple yet powerful, that they did not need permission to care. That helping did not require recognition. That rest was not weakness, and silence was not absence. Sandra returned to her work with a new sense of intention, choosing stories that reflected humanity in its quiet strength rather than its loudest conflicts. Keanu continued his life much as he always had, moving through the world with humility, offering kindness in moments no one would ever record. They did not stop caring. They simply stopped carrying everything alone. Occasionally, messages arrived, updates from places they had once supported, now thriving in their own imperfect ways. Sandra read them with gratitude. Keanu smiled at them and then put his phone away, choosing to stay present where he was. They no longer felt the urge to respond to everything. They trusted that the work would continue without them intervening at every turn. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city lights began to flicker on, Sandra asked a question that had been quietly forming in her mind. "Do you think the world is kinder now?" Keanu considered it carefully. "I think the world is the same," he said slowly, "but more people believe they can be kind, and that changes everything." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They sat there until the sky darkened completely, comfortable in the knowledge that what they had helped begin was no longer fragile. It did not depend on silence or visibility, on presence or absence. It lived in choices made every day by people who might never know their story and didn't need to. And somewhere a child shared food with another child. A stranger listened instead of walking away. A caregiver rested without guilt. No one called it a movement. No one attached names to it. It simply existed, steady and real. That was the world Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock never tried to change, yet helped shape by refusing to be the center of it. A world where kindness didn't wait to be seen, because it understood that its greatest power was never in being noticed, but in being passed on. And in that quiet truth, they found peace.